Brian Stevenson, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
I wanted to begin by asking you about something that you say often, and every time I have heard it, I've thought, that's interesting, but I'm not sure I quite understand it, which is that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. What do you mean by that?
America's an incredibly wealthy country, but we've always had enormous stratification. The wealth of the colonies was built on a genocide of removing Native Americans from lands that they occupied. We kept their names, but we made them leave. There were millions of Native people on this continent before white settlers came, and we killed them through famine and war and disease. And we didn't really acknowledge the injustice of that, the unfairness of that, because we were persuaded that our economic security and our political development required the acquisition of these lands. And it began this way of thinking about wealth that is disconnected from the inequality, the injustice, the abuse, the oppression that is sometimes used to create that wealth. And that habit was reinforced through slavery. And we created great wealth in new territories in the South, in the colonies, by relying on enslaved people and the labor and the benefits that created without any real thinking about how that wealth was sustained by abuse and oppression and inequality and injustice. And even after slavery, I don't think we ever really dealt with the unfairness of exploiting people for decades, centuries, and then doing nothing to help make them whole. And it wasn't just formerly enslaved people. It was poor whites that came to this country as immigrants who were also often abused in working places and mines. And this idea has emerged in America that wealth is created by people with great talent and great ability. And we value wealth, we respect wealth, we admire wealth, and we disdain the poor. We blame the poor. We fault the poor for not achieving more economic security. And we have I think, a really unevolved attitude about how to address poverty. When I look at our history of using power and abuse to sustain and create structural poverty and institutionalize it without any shame, it makes me question whether we truly understand what poverty represents. There are a lot of countries across the world that are poor. But in most of the developing world, 90% of the people, 80% of the people are poor. And when you look at your neighbors and you look at the people on the other side of town, you don't see people who have great wealth, and you don't internalize what it means to be poor because everybody's poor. But in this country, poor people live in proximity with great wealth, and what they see on TV and what they see in politics and what they see in power are largely people who have enough wealth and support. And so I think it's actually really hard to be poor in a country like ours, where you're often pressured to internalize what it means to be poor. You begin to blame yourself. And so for me, it's important to redefine what it is we are dealing with when we deal with poverty. And that definition begins in recognizing that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. If we actually had been just to those communities that we removed from the land, if we had been just to the formerly enslaved, if we'd been just to immigrants who came and gave great wealth, Irish, Italian, South American, Mexican, we would actually be in a very different place when it comes to dealing with structural poverty. And so for me, if we're going to end poverty, we're going to have to elevate our commitment to justice. We're going to actually have to talk about the institutions and the histories that have created this sustained poverty. And that's what I mean when I say the opposite of poverty is justice. It means that we've got to actually think about how our indifference to unjust, unfair, exploitative, oppressive treatment of the poor, of low-income workers, of immigrants has created a nation that is so economically stratified. And we're not going to get to ending that stratification, ending that poverty, until we increase our commitment to doing what's just.
I recognize, and I apologize for the size of this next question. What is justice?
Justice is a constant struggle. I wish I could define something precise, that I could give you an equilibrium that was the answer to what justice is. But after doing what I've done for as long as I've done it, I am persuaded that justice is a constant struggle. It is something that can be achieved when people of goodwill work hard to be fair, when they think about what's appropriate, what's reasonable, what's just. And it's like being in an ocean in a rowboat. You have to keep working at it if you're going to make progress. Otherwise, you start letting other forces carry you in directions that are going to end up in places that are unjust, unfair. It's what happens when people come together and aspire to achieve something that is equal and fair and humane and uplifts everyone. You know, Dr. King said, justice is what love looks like in public. And there is something to this idea that it's a commitment to embracing the people around you, protecting the people around you, protecting those who are disfavored or excluded, or who are unpopular. And it's a commitment to be governed by values and principles and norms that we all share. But even with those norms and values, it doesn't really work unless there's constant struggle.